Welcome to Chapter 4 in EDU 3339. Today we're going to talk about planning in the problem-based classroom. This may be a little different for some of you, as you might have grown up in a very traditional mathematics classroom where problem solving only came at the end of the chapter after you had done all of the skill-based algorithms and procedures. But we are now going to learn how to actually teach in a problem-based classroom. So our agenda for today is we're going to talk about lesson planning, meeting the needs of diverse learners. We're going to talk about drill and practice, and then I'm going to kind of lay out a scenario for you and how a particular teacher teaches through problem-based learning. So I captured this picture, as you can see, from page 60 in your textbook. I wanted us to talk about this for just a few minutes. I really like what the author has done with this, and I think it really ties in with our Florida Southern lesson plan nicely. The first thing we have to do is determine the mathematics goals. As you know, our goals are the Florida standards. So the first thing we need to do in making a lesson plan is to figure out what standard we are teaching. Most of the time the teachers know because of the curriculum maps they are given. So next we consider our students. What type of students do we have in the classroom? How is that goal going to impact them? Do you think it's going to be an easy goal or an easy standard for them to learn? Consider their needs. Always go back to that goal. Next, we're going to think about a task. Now, this isn't the activity. This is the task. So it might be selecting a problem or two out of the textbook. So really what you're saying to yourself is, I'm going to use this problem and this problem to teach today. And that's going to be my lesson. It's not really the activity that you're having the students do or the practice, it's what you're using to teach through. And again, we want to make sure that those tasks line up with the mathematics goals. Next, and most importantly, you have to think about the assessment that you're going to give the students. How will you assess them on the standard? Because however you assess them needs to be how you're teaching them. You cannot assess them one way and have taught the lesson a totally different way. It confuses the students and it's really not fair to them. And you must make sure that your lesson assessments line up with the standards or the mathematics goals. So after you have that taken care of, then in the lesson plan, you're going to think about the before activities. In our lesson plan, that's the introduction. Okay? What do they need to know? Do they need to know some mathematics vocabulary? Do you need to connect it to yesterday's lesson? How do you need to introduce this lesson? The before activities. Now we have the during activities. Okay? So this is like your instruction. Now you're going to also plan your questions that you're going to ask your students and any extensions that you want them to do. And then number 7 would be like our guided practice. Plan the after. How are they going to practice this so that they can learn the particular problem-based approach that you are teaching them? Finally, after the lesson, after you've written most of that lesson plan, you're going to check for the alignment. Make sure that those standards are aligned with all of the activities before, during, and after, aligned with the assessment. You are also going to anticipate how students are going to approach the problem. This is where you're going to do your differentiated instruction. You're going to think about your students that are above level and your students that are on level and your students that are below level and the ELL students in your classroom. Anticipate those difficulties and plan for them. And then lastly, the book says to identify an essential question. I would say that's probably a good idea, and it should be your objective, really. If your objective is that the students learn to add using word problems, then your essential question could be for the students, how do I use addition in helping me to solve word problems? So you can see how this kind of lines up with our lesson plan as well. And we're going to work more with that as the semester goes on. Next, we're going to talk about meeting the needs of diverse learners. So there are some considerations that you have to look for. Basically, you need to know your students. You can't go in and teach effectively without knowing the students. That's why it's very difficult to just walk into a classroom and say, hey, can I teach a lesson for today? Because you don't really know those students. So knowing the students will help you to be able to plan effectively to meet their needs. Now, how can you differentiate? In math, it's the same as in reading or in any other subject. You can differentiate the content, so what you want each student to be able to do, the process, how you're going to engage them in the learning, or the product. What do they have to show for what they've learned? You can also differentiate that physical learning environment. You can move the students to pair with different students that might help them. You can also move students up front. You can group them differently. Moving students away from a noisy air conditioner that might distract them. Whatever the case may be, you can differentiate the physical environment as well. Now, to meet the needs of diverse learners, your book suggests that there are tiered lessons. Basically, the learning goals need to be the same for all the students, but you sometimes have to adapt that level of difficulty for the task. And the book suggests that you can adapt the amount of teacher assistance that is provided. So perhaps during the guided practice, most students are working in pairs, but you know that there are 3 students in your classroom that are struggling with this particular concept, and so you pull them back to the back table and provide them assistance. That is a form of differentiation and meeting their needs in that way. How structured the lesson is. So you want to add structure for students with special needs because they need more guidance as the problem is being given to them. Sometimes they might need steps on how to solve the problem. You might want to even write steps out and tape it to their desk so that they're always following those particular steps. On the reverse of that, your gifted learners, give them more open-ended problems so that they can learn to solve them the way their brain works. It could be the complexity of the tasks. You can either make it more concrete or more abstract by either adding modeling or manipulative or not. I would suggest adding that modeling and manipulative. And then the complexity of the process, so that's adapting the pace of the lesson and how many instructions you give at one time. So there are lots of ways to meet the needs of those diverse learners in the mathematics classroom. Here's an example of a tiered lesson. Here's the problem. Eduardo has 6 cars and Erica has 8 cars. So a middle level might be using harder numbers where they have to add 2 digits. You could even do one where they had to carry. But look at the advanced. Eduardo has blank cars and Erica has blank cars. Together they have 25. How many cars might Eduardo have and how many might Erica have? So it's the same problem basically. It could be the same problem, but you're tiering it to meet the needs. You're still teaching the skill right here of addition word problems. Okay, now let's talk about drill and practice. So practice, basically, when we have our students practice, we give them different tasks or experiences and we stretch those out, but it's on the same idea. So let's say I'm teaching fractions, adding, subtracting fractions with like denominators. We might be on that for 3 days, and I'm going to give them different ways to do that so that they can practice that particular skill that they need to learn. However, drill is a little more repetitive, and it's usually not problem-based, okay? It's it reviews procedures or algorithms, and sometimes that is needed, but I would strongly recommend that teachers not spend as much time on drill and spend more time on practice. I don't see a problem with spending the first 5 to 7 minutes of a class kind of drilling, having a little fun, getting in a little rehearsal of those skills, but then move to the problem-based tasks, the real-world tasks. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about a scenario, and I'm basically going to tell you a story in this scenario. So here we go. Miss Davis has written this problem on the board. Sandy has 46 baseball cards. Her brother gave her 37 baseball cards for her birthday. Now how many baseball cards does Sandy have? Miss Davis says, today we're going to work on some story problems, just like you've been doing for the past few days. We'll begin by thinking about the first problem together. Read the problem to yourself and try to picture what is happening in the story. Then decide what the story is asking you to find out. After about a minute, she says, raise your hand if you've had enough time to figure out what is happening in this story problem. 20 of the 25 students raise their hands. Miss Davis says, I'm going to read the problem out loud, and I want everyone to try to picture what is happening in this problem. She reads the problem. Miss Davis then turns to Isaiah, who raised his hand previously, and says, Isaiah, can you tell us what happens first in this story problem? Isaiah slowly responds, First, Sandy has 46 baseball cards. Miss Davis begins making a flow chart. She writes, Sandy has 46 cards and draws a rectangle around it. Then what happens? She pauses for students to think. What happens next? Emma? Her brother gives her 37 more baseball cards, Emma says. Miss Davis draws another rectangle. Inside she writes, Brother gave her 37 cards. Then she asks, what happens next? Turn to a partner and discuss what happens next. She allows the students to discuss for a few minutes on the carpet, then brings them back together. She calls on Marcus. Marcus says, how many cards does she have now? Mrs. Davis records the following. Miss Davis says, so let's read our problem together. She leads the class in choral reading of the chart sequencing the action of the story. What do we have to find out? She calls on Aaliyah. Aaliyah says, we have to find out how many cards she has now. Miss Davis asks, how can we find out how many cards Sandy has now? Turn to a partner and discuss that. The students discuss for a few moments. Miss Davis notices that some really know what is going on and are talking about addition. Others seem a little confused. She calls on Aaliyah. You have to add 37 cards to the 46 because now she has more. Miss Davis asks, who agrees with what Aaliyah just said? All hands go up. Miss Davis writes the numbers 46 and 37 and a question mark under the boxes in the flow chart. How can we show that we're adding 37 to 46? Turn to a partner and discuss that. The children begin to pick up that in order to show that you're adding, an addition sign needs to be put between the two numbers. Mrs. Davis calls the children back to order. Sam, how do you think we could do that? put a plus sign? That's right. We use an addition sign to show that we're adding. Mrs. Davis writes 46 plus 37 equals question mark on the board. She continues. Let's read this together. The class reads the equation as Mrs. Davis points. 46 plus 37 equals something. Mrs. Davis asks, what's the something you have to find out? Turn to a partner and discuss this. As the students begin to discuss, a few of them start picking up on the baseball cards, the cards that were the original part of the story. As she brings the students back together, Mrs. Davis asks James, what's the something you have to find out, James? James says, you have to find out how many baseball cards Sandy has now. So now we've translated the story problem into an equation. And James just told us we have to find out what 46 cards and 37 cards adds up to. Now I'd like you to think of a strategy that you could use to solve this problem. You can look at the chart of addition strategies to help you. Choose a strategy that makes sense to you and that you think is efficient. When you have a strategy, put your hand on your head. When I know you have a strategy, I will call on you to go back to your seat and get started. You will have about 25 minutes to work on these problems. Now let's think about this. The lesson begins with a problem, and Mrs. Davis does not tell the students how to solve it. That's something I think we need to get used to, because most times in a math class what we've seen is a teacher puts a problem on the board and models how to solve it, instead of letting the children figure out what the problem is about. Instead, Mrs. Davis deliberately focuses students on visualizing the sequence of the actions in the problem. Then she translates the problem into an equation, figuring out what needs to be found out, and then allows the students to choose a strategy to solve it. So instead of telling students key words, Ms. Davis gives them time and focus questions to help them make sense of any word problem. As they went back to their seat, they had several word problems. Her goal was to have all the students leave the carpet area understanding the first problem with an idea for a strategy that they could use to solve it. So now she is supporting all her students in becoming problem solvers with the remainder of the addition problems. So really, what is mathematics? Math is more than a procedure or an algorithm. Math is understanding the meaning of the problems and finding ways to solve the problem. You'll find as we continue in this course this semester that you will learn how to teach the meaning of the problems and assist your students into finding ways to solve the problems.